Folklore. The beliefs, traditions, and culture of the people. Passed on in the most part through the spoken word, folklore expresses our values, our shared ideas with others. It is both how we were and how we are. Without a record, our customs and traditions may become lost to us in the present. But under the surface, we still draw on them. We still know. It's time to recall our forgotten history and to record the new. This is the Folklore Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Folklore Podcast. I'm Mark Norman, folklore author and researcher. In this episode of the podcast, I'm joined from the US by Ben Radford, who will be discussing his extensive research into the lore of the Chupacabra. Ben is deputy editor of Skeptical Inquirer magazine and a research fellow at the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, where his colleagues include Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson. He is author, co-author or contributor to over 20 books, as well as thousands of articles. Ben appears as an expert regularly on many major news outlets and documentaries. His full, extensive biography is on the guest page on the podcast website, and it is an honour to welcome him to our show. There are very few interviews on the Chupacabra and its folklore that are really in-depth, but this one was definitely extensive. Sadly, I have had to edit some sections for time. The e-magazine supplement for this episode, however, contains a complete transcript of the whole interview, as well as Ben's suggested reading. This is free for all our patrons to download on Patreon, and available for just 99p, or a little over $1, from the Folklore shop on our website at www.thefolklorepodcast.com. For more details of how to become a patron and get all of our episode supplements for free, please listen to the end credits at the end of this programme. For now, here is Ben Radford and his interview on the Chupacabra. So let's start perhaps by you giving us a bit of a brief overview of the history of this creature and what it's all about for those that don't know much about it.
Sure, yeah. The Chupacabra is... it's probably the world's second best-known creature after Nessie, Loch Ness Monster, and Bigfoot. It's sort of probably ties second after Bigfoot in terms of sort of being a universally known cryptid. That is something that is unlike, for example, and of course. As you know, and many people don't, and of course many listeners of this podcast do know, for example, dragons and fairies, to the general public, it's, these are, clearly mythical creatures, but as you've discussed on your previous shows, many people really do, in modern times, believe in these sorts of things. But creatures such as Nessie and Bigfoot and the Chupacabra and Mothman, those sort of hold a different status, certainly in cryptozoology, in that they are widely believed, at least ostensibly. And so that was what intrigued me about the Chupacabra. I had previous experience in doing cryptozoological research with Bigfoot, and I'd researched Bigfoot sightings and also in lake monsters. I co-authored a book, Lake Monster Mysteries, with Joe Nickel, and I've researched lake monsters in different countries around the world. And so I had some background in exploring and investigating some of these zoological mysteries, but the Chupacabra was a bit of a different beast. And one thing that really intrigued me about it, and just sort of to give the overview, the Chupacabra is, the word comes from the Spanish for bloodsucker, or goatsucker. And chupa meaning to suck, and cabra meaning goat. And depending on which version you look at. In my book, I explain that there's actually several different versions. There's not just sort of one But depending on which version you're looking at, it is a sort of a spiky-backed bipedal creature with sort of oblong eyes, sort of alien-esque eyes, no nose, no ears, just sort of this weird, about 4 feet tall creature that is unlike any known animal in the world. And then a second version, Chupacabra, emerged in about 2000. And that was a more a canid type. So you're talking dogs, coyotes, foxes. So these were these were quadrupeds. They essentially looked like dogs with mange. They were hairless usually. They had no spikes down the back. They just looked like sick dogs, essentially. And so these are the two main versions of Chupacabra that emerged over the past 30 years. And so, or 20 some years. And so it was interesting to sort of see how these things teased out. But one thing that intrigued me about the Chupacabra was that, unlike Bigfoot and Nessie, it was a vampire, because its signature was sucking the blood out of livestock, primarily goats, but also chickens, cattle, things like that. And it was widely believed throughout Latin America, particularly in Puerto Rico, Mexico, Central America, and elsewhere. And so that was really what intrigued me. Was I said, well, hold on here. I mean, you have this creature that's widely known that it's a vampire. That is unusual, right? And because it's a vampire, that lends itself to actual forensic investigation, because vampires suck blood. That's what they do. Certainly the types of vampires most people are familiar with. And so because it does that, there should be trails of bodies. I mean, we should find all these bodies that have been mysteriously sucked to blood, and there's actual, it's not just ambiguous sightings on a lake or in the deep woods, or black cats or what have you. It's actually, there should be tangible evidence, and that's really what intrigued me about it.
So in your book, Tracking the Chupacabra, and I'll put a link to that book on your guest page on our website so that people can go and look at it for themselves. You kind of started that book in this way by looking at this vampire lore. So why did you start off in that way? Was it because there was this possibility of having forensic evidence that you could start to look at right at the beginning of the investigation?
That's part of it. Once I sort of zoomed in on what in retrospect is the pretty obvious fact that it's a vampire, then that sort of gave me a context or a prism through which to understand the creature, whether it was real or not. I mean, keep in mind, I spent 5 years researching this. I say that, either out of pride or stupidity, take your pick. But I mean, I took it seriously, and I put a lot of time and effort into trying to figure out what was going on. I traveled to the jungles of Central America. I interviewed eyewitnesses. I mean, I took this very seriously. This wasn't a joke. When I began the research and investigation, I didn't know whether I would find a Chupacabra or not. I didn't think so, but I was certainly open to the possibility, and I believe that you have to actually investigate. And so that was really what drove me, was saying, all right, well, let's take this seriously. Let's assume that that there may be some truth behind these, and go forward. And that was sort of why I initially nailed down its origin and its nature, because again, it is a vampire. And as I mentioned, because it's a vampire, there are certain acts and characteristics of vampires that we should see if it's real. And that, again, that's what distinguishes it from other prominent cryptids. And so I realized that in order to understand the Chupacabra's nature or lore, or at least the idea surrounding, you had to, regardless of whether it's real or not, it is believed to be a vampire, and that was sort of the hook that I used to begin the research.
Sure, and vampires obviously we find in different cultures all around the world, but you tended to focus on the European vampire lore when you were talking about this in the book. Now, what links or similarities did you find then between the cryptid that is the Chupacabra, for want of a better term, and this European vampire lore that you were looking at?
Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, the first thing to sort of tease out, and again, this is sort of old hat to folklorists and people who are familiar with vampire lore and this and that, but it's not really well known outside of that and to the general public. But of course, there's many types of vampires. The vampire that most people today are familiar with, certainly in the Western world, are revenants. The raised humans, people who people used to be alive, then they died, and they were brought back to life either on their own volition or through other means, and so that's where we get the Dracula and these other versions of vampires. But in fact, the Chupacabra is an earlier form of the vampire, and the two characteristics. You can go back and see the early vampires, back in ancient Greece, for example, in ancient Egypt. You had these vampires that were much more akin to demons or spirits that were flying around and causing harm to people. And obviously there's lots of depending on the subtype of vampire you're talking about, there's different lore associated with each of them. So for example, there's with the revenants and the more the sort of sparkly vampires, if you will, there's the whole they can't see the reflection in a mirror, and they're afraid of garlic and steaks and all that, and that's all well and good. But the two key parts of vampire lore that I focused on in order to understand the Chupacabra was, number one, the idea of draining blood or energy, etc., through physical contact. And so that was the touching or biting or some physical contact drains either a physical substance or energy or something like that. And the other one is the notion of vampires being blamed for unexpected death or misfortune. And that was sort of what I latched onto when I was looking at the Chupacabra, because in chapter 2 of my book I talk about the late Middle Ages and vampire lore in Europe, for example, and how if there was something bad happening, there was a baby was stillborn, for example, or a cow stopped giving milk, or there was a drought, or locusts, or whatever went on. People looked for a reason, right? Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We have tendencies towards magical thinking. And so, we look for why bad things happen to good people, and oftentimes the answer to many people was it's a vampire. So they would try and look around for or a witch, or something in that category. There's some external evil that's doing this bad thing to me, and if we just appease the gods, or if we just stake the vampire, dig up this person, and we can make things right. So those are the two parts that really jumped out at me in terms of the common threads between the European vampire and the Chupacabra, and that actually emerged quite a bit in my later research into the Caribbean stories about the Chupacabra.
That's it. There always has to be a scapegoat, doesn't there? So in these areas that you then went on to look at in the Caribbean, in the Americas, what vampire roots were you finding there? Was it a similar sort of thing, or is it slightly different set of motifs that you're looking at there?
It was a slightly different set of motifs. I tried to sort of bring in. I touched a little bit on African vampires and also Latin American vampires in my book. So. And again, this goes back to some of the later stories of what the Chupacabra does in terms of sucking blood. Now there's a handful of reports of Chupacabras attacking people, but by far, and most of those have been pretty quickly determined to be hoaxes. But by far the greatest, the most common is attacking animals and livestock, and of course by extension, that's their economic lifeblood. I mean, you have to understand the Chupacabra through the prism of those who believe it. And, to you or me, the idea that a Chupacabra might attack 5 cows in the middle of Puerto Rico or Nicaragua is, well, so what? I mean, okay, so, there's some cows dead. But to a small farmer, they may have 6 cows and 5 of them are now dead and something killed them. And that is a serious issue. It's not a joke. It's not funny. To people who are living subsistence lives, particularly in rural parts of Latin America, the Chupacabra is a very real threat to their lifeblood and their economic well-being. And so it has to be viewed through that prism. And so when I was looking at the Chupacabra, when I was looking at vampires, for example, in Africa and in Latin America, one of the things I honed in on was again the elements of rumors of organ theft and blood theft. And I had previously written about kidney theft and organ theft. I'd written a couple articles for 40 Times magazine and also Skeptical Inquirer on the kidney theft urban legends and, the kidneys being stolen and all that. And that ties in very nicely, in fact, with vampires, because, again, you're having a bodily substance that's being taken and used for illicit purposes. And so I talked a little bit about the Liquichiri, which is a vampire that I researched in La Paz, Bolivia in the 90s. And it's this vampire of the cold Altiplano in the Andes. And instead of blood, it sucks people's fat. So it's a fat sucker. And it's really interesting. And I interviewed an ethnologist in Bolivia who talked about it, and it's believed to be a real thing. And again, to you and me, the idea of some unknown entity stealing our fat is like, hey, that's great. I'll be over here. I got a few pounds I can get rid of.
Yeah.
But again, you have to understand these rumors and legends within the context they circulate. And in Central and South America, especially in the high Andes, fat keeps you alive, literally. And so once again, you see, the fat theft it's a threat to their survival, and it's not a joke. And so the idea is this Liquichiri vampire entity goes around, steals people's fat, and then uses it to make a variety of things, including cosmetics and different substances for North American industries. And so, again, there's this notion of American and Western European imperialism that you see over and over again in these vampire legends. This idea that the resources, literally the blood and the fat and the treasure of people throughout Latin America and elsewhere, Africa as well, are drained and taken away metaphorically, in some cases literally, by evil superpowers that speak English, primarily Americans and Canadians, and to some degree Western Europeans. And so this motif, to bring this back to the Caribbean, this motif was very much present when I was looking at the folklore of the Chupacabra in Puerto Rico. Because Puerto Rico has a sort of an uncomfortable history with America, because the United States owns Puerto Rico. It's a territory of ours, but it's not a state, and it doesn't have states' rights. It is one of a handful of sort of far-flung, almost post-colonial entities, if you will. And there's a strong sense in Puerto Rico that I both read about and saw firsthand when I visited there and did some research there, that Americans are taking resources, taking lumber, taking not gold, but oil and other things like that, and taking labor and sugar and stuff. And so there was this very palpable sense of a metaphoric vampirism that I saw and research in Puerto Rico, and because again it's the United States owns it, but they don't have voting rights. They don't have they essentially have nothing. They feel very exploited. And Puerto Rico is perpetually in economic crisis. I was every year or two, I see some story about some new economic crisis in Puerto Rico. They're bankrupt. It's just a mess down there, and they blame a lot of that on the United States. And so that sort of feeds into the antipathy towards the U.S. And it may seem like what I'm talking about is far afield from the Chupacabra, but it's not. It actually folds right back in, because that one of the common threads in the Chupacabra folklore is this anti-Americanism and the idea of what Americans are doing to them through the Chupacabra.
Well, this is it, isn't it? It's natural for us as human beings, whatever country we're in, within our folklore, to draw on those things that cause us fear, and to find these symbols that we can use to represent that fear within the belief systems that we operate within. So with a fat sucking vampire, that is, you're literally getting a representation of this fear of Western culture sucking the life out of your country or your...
Absolutely.
And you find the same, I guess, with the Chupacabra. You say about, a farmer may have 6 cows and 5 are killed, then certainly that's no joke. And it's that fear of your livelihood being taken away by something that's outside of your control. And I guess that's what's happening here, isn't it?
No, that's exactly right.
Yeah. So we're interested, aren't we, as folklorists, at trying to find the origin of stories. Now, I guess you when you approach something from two sides, like we were saying before, you've got that investigative side, and there you're looking for what is this creature if it exists, or where has this come from, in a physical sense, and then we're looking within folklore, within that other way of looking at these things, as the origin story as to where these beliefs come from in the first place. In the very first podcast that we did, we talked about Slenderman with Andrea Kitter, and that was something where we were tracing a very definite origin story, and a quite recent one, and it was easy to see where that came from. It was an internet origin that then developed from there. The Chupacabra as a symbol or as a creature is also, I guess, quite recent. So can we trace the origins of this story in a similar way?
We can, or I should say, I did, and it was fascinating. And I'm glad you brought up Kitta and Slenderman. I heard that episode and it was great. And I've met Andrea Kitta, and she's a wonderful researcher. And I'm glad to sort of see her and others, giving more expert commentary, of course, along with you on these sorts of things, and sort of helping the public to understand some of the nuances that may be lost otherwise.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've discovered in my investigating these, weird, mysterious, whatever thing you want to call them, is that these weird, seemingly inexplicable things don't occur in a vacuum. There is always a specific set of socio-cultural circumstances from which these things emerge. And it could be the satanic panic scare in the U.S. in the 1980s. It could be the Chupacabra. It could be stories of the demonic possession. The film The Exorcist was very influential in fomenting the public's beliefs about exorcisms later on, etc. And so that's one thing that I've really keyed on in my investigations, is trying to understand these things have to be understood in context. You can't just say, well, here's this weird thing. Isn't this strange? Well, it is strange, and what's around it. In order to understand what something is, you have to understand what's around it. Where did this come from? How did this emerge? And that was one of the big challenges to me. And so when I was researching the book, I'd gotten about, I'm going to say, maybe 2/3 of the way through researching the book. And I had interviewed, dozens of people, everything from medical pathologists to eyewitnesses, researchers, wildlife predation experts, just up and down the line. And I went out for a television show called Monster Quest, and I looked at a Chupacabra / canine head in a freezer and things like that. And Susie, by the time I was about 2/3 of the way through the book, I had solved most of the mystery. I was pretty sure that I knew what the alleged Chupacabra victims were and what the sightings were. I'd parsed all that out, but there was one big remaining question, and the one elephant in the room, the Chupacabra in the room, was, where did it come from? What was the origin? And that was the big thorny $1 million question that I ended up really turning to and trying to focus on it. And that was what was most interesting to me, was could I trace back, or could anyone trace back the origin of this, because as you know, it's fairly rare to be able to identify a specific origin point. We could do that with Slender Man, for example. We know exactly we know the date and time when
Yes.
Slender Man emerged. But Slender Man is a rare exception. For most cases, as you know, I mean, I can't count the number of times someone's asked me, so when did the Vanishing Hitchhiker emerge? Well,
Yeah.
how do I even, or take your pick. I mean, and it's just because they're just, I mean, we can, or La Llorona. I mean, I researched La Llorona for one of my books. I mean, we can trace through the threads and find early references, and that's part of the fun of folkloric research. I mean, that's the great part. And so we can do that, but in terms of being able to identify a specific origin point, that's very rare. And so the challenge to me was to see if I could do that. And so when you're looking at zoological origins, there's always this interesting phenomena in which creatures that are otherwise fairly recent are given a false history in order to make them seem by believers more believable, right? And so you had, for example, with Bigfoot and Sasquatch. Really the earliest sightings, as my friend Daniel Loxton talks about in his book Abominable Science with Don Prothero, he does a great job in tracing back the origins of these creatures. And in many of these cases, they're not that old. Bigfoot really only dates back to the 40s and 50s. Nessie only dates back to the 30s or so. I mean, so there simply is not a centuries-old provenance to draw upon from which that makes these creatures more plausible. And so what happens then is that people who believe in these creatures, who promote their existence, they sort of co-opt other stories. So, for example, with Bigfoot and Sasquatch, oftentimes you have people talking about native legends. They say, oh, well, it's true that modern Bigfoot sightings only date back so far, but if you look back at these legends and stories, from this First Nations group, whatever else, they speak about this wild man in the woods. And they sort of try and co-opt or nudge or force fit or shoehorn that into evidence for Bigfoot. And it's just simply not. When you go back and you look at those stories in context, as I said before, very important, you find that they're not actually talking about an actual physical wild man in the woods, and that wild man in the woods stories and boogeyman in the woods stories are very common. They're not necessarily evidence for Bigfoot. And I also saw this, for example, when I was investigating Ogopogo, the lake monster in Lake Okanagan, British Columbia. It was fascinating stuff. I did research out there with National Geographic and investigation out there. And once again, you had people who were sort of talking about, oh, well, the First Nations people knew it as this other creature, Naitaka or Nahaikt, that was this water serpent creature, water spirit in the lake that Indians would sacrifice dogs to and other animals to cross the lake safely. And once again, that's not actually true. If you go back and you look at what people are claiming as the early reports of the Ogopogo lake monster, they're not talking about a physical slimy serpent creature. They're talking about a water spirit that can command storms, right? And so anyway, so there's parallels with other creatures and cryptids. And so or you can look at Nessie and the stories of Saint Columba. That are sort of roped in the 6th century, that there was the saint stories about turning back a serpent in the Ness River, and so exactly that sort of phenomenon occurs with Chupacabra. And the thing about the Chupacabra is its existence poses a thorny problem for people who believe in it because there's no provenance. There's no reports that I found of any Chupacabras before 1995. There's no reports in 1990. There's no reports in 1982. There's no reports in 1967. They don't exist.
That's interesting as well, isn't it? That it is quite a modern symbol, if you like.
It is. So it's interesting because it is such a modern creature And again, sort of like Slender Man. I mean, there's lots of parallels between Chupacabra and Slender Man. And because it is such a modern creature, number one, that did two things. Number one, it allowed me to solve the mystery because that meant there was a limited data set, right? If this thing only emerged in 1995, I've only got 15 at the time years to research, right? I don't have to pour through literally hundreds and hundreds of Bigfoot tracks and sightings and reports and and videos and hoaxes. I mean, there's too much out there for something that dates back decades. But in the case of Chupacabra, because it was so recent, that allowed me to sort of get my mind around it, because there was only so many reports, there's only so many eyewitnesses, there's only so many incidences of it appearing, and because it was a small enough data set, I was able to sort of put it all on my desk on one time, metaphorically, and look at it. And so again, as I mentioned, the Chupacabra's lack of provenance before the 1990s posed a problem, because creatures don't just magically appear, right? I mean, they don't. In the real world, it's not like the giraffe was first seen in 1983 in Mozambique. Like that's not how that works, right?
No. We have this thing called evolution that most of us believe in.
Exactly, and because of that, all animals have parents and lineages, etc. And so, but the Chupacabra was unique because it just popped. It just popped into the public's into the world in 95, and so for people who believed in it, they had a problem because they had to explain that. And there's two explanations for the Chupacabra. The first one was that the Chupacabra wasn't extraterrestrial. That is, it was either an alien itself, or in some versions, I heard a story that it was an alien's pet. So the idea was that UFOs had visited Puerto Rico, as one does. It's a nice place, go to the beaches, whatever. And while they were visiting Puerto Rico, they opened up the door and they were going to, put some anal probes in some hillbilly, whatever. And the alien Chupacabra pet jumped out before they could catch it and escaped into the El Yunque rainforest in Puerto Rico. So that was one version, and I'll just dryly say that I'm skeptical of that. The second version is actually somewhat more interesting, and there's some parallels there. The second version is that the Chupacabra is a sort of top secret U.S. government genetic experiment gone wrong, sort of a Frankenstein story. And again, it's specifically U.S., right? It wasn't a top secret French experiment gone wrong. It wasn't, it wasn't the Japanese. It was Americans. Again, keep in mind this happened in Puerto Rico, and who are they blaming? America. They're blaming the bad parent who ignores them and exploits them, right? Yeah. And so it was fascinating research because, again, these are these two theories. Like, again, escaped alien from outer space, or B, a genetic experiment gone wrong. That the story goes there is a top secret military base in the jungles of El Yunque, and I've been to El Yunque. It's not far from the capital of San Juan, and it's a rainforest and it's fairly thick. And the idea is that there's a government base there, and that experiments go on there. Let your mind go from there, right? Experience on the Montauk Monster, or creating Slender Man or Bigfoot or whatever else. But in this case, the idea was that they were splicing genes together in some unholy experiment, and a tropical storm came through. And just as they were completing this experiment, and the winds broke up, the storm damaged the facility, and this creature that the American scientists had been creating managed to escape into the wilderness, and that's where it lived and hid and sucked the blood of things. So.
And this is the creature. This is the creature in its first form, in the
yes.
humanoid form. Yeah.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. And so those were the two original origin stories for the Chupacabra, and since that time, I did a follow-up. I'll just touch on them briefly. I did a follow-up article in Skeptical Inquirer magazine in the January-February 2016 issue titled "Mistaken Memories of Vampires: Pseudo-Histories of the Chupacabra," and in those I examine three stories about the Chupacabra's origin that emerged in the years afterwards. And one of them says that the Chupacabra was sort of an Native American witch doctor's pet that was seen in the United States. One of them was that there's ties in with ancient aliens, and another one was that the Taino Indians, which are known around the area in Puerto Rico, had eaten the Chupacabra. In fact, there's a delightful illustration that I reprint in the book of two Taino Indian couples who are roasting a Chupacabra on a spit over an open fire that I just found delightful. Anyway, there's others as well, but so again, it's fascinating to see the wide variety and often completely contradictory ideas about where the Chupacabra emerged in the absence of real scholarship. And to be fair, all these origin stories emerged before I had written my book, and so I hope that my research will sort of inform people in terms of the true history of the Chupacabra. So I can't really blame them for ignoring my book when it hadn't come out then, but there's quite a few out there.
Sure. And this whole theory of gene splicing, then, to go back to this idea, this suggests to me that, and I think you found the same, didn't you? That this whole kind of conspiracy theory around the folklore of the Chupacabra then forms.
Yes, absolutely. And it's fascinating when you go back and you look at the conspiracy theory theme in Chupacabra lore is very strong, and you don't really find that with other monsters. There isn't a strong conspiracy theory theme in Bigfoot research, for example, or in Nessie, what have you. But there is a very strong one in the Chupacabra lore, and I trace that back to the influence of UFO buffs in Puerto Rico, who latched on to the original very first sighting of the Chupacabra that emerged in 1995. There was the very first sighting of the Chupacabra emerged. It occurred. The first sighting of a Chupacabra emerged in 1995. It was seen by a woman named Madeline Tolentino. And Tolentino was the first person to ever see what would later become the Chupacabra, and she described it as the original type of Chupacabra I discussed. It was a sort of a bipedal creature, had sort of oval head, alien wraparound eyes, very prominent spikes down the back, long slender fingers, bipedal, and this is what she saw. And I interviewed her at her home in Puerto Rico for my book, and it was fascinating talking to her. Nobody had really talked to her for many years after her sighting. I tracked her down and did that. But what had happened was that when her sighting first emerged, the first people to latch onto it and promote it and talk about it were UFO believers. In particular, there was a guy named Jorge Martin. And Puerto Rico is actually a hotspot for UFO beliefs. It's not necessarily widely known, but there's many UFO believers in Puerto Rico, of course elsewhere as well. But it's particularly strong in Puerto Rico and in San Juan. And it just so happened that the first people to interview Tolentino and to sort of get her story out in the media, and the internet was just first emerging around this time. Again, this was 95, 96, 97, and so the internet played a big role in the Chupacabra's eventual dominating the world of cryptids, and I can talk a little bit about that later. But their influence and their sort of putting their own alien-esque spin on the Chupacabra was a big part of why the conspiracy theories later got attached to it. And keep in mind that aliens and UFOs, and that lore is rife with conspiracies. Probably more so than most of the other subjects that I research. It's just part and parcel of their belief system. Partly because, of course, their excuse for why they don't have better evidence for alien bodies or alien contact or whatever else is that it's a cover-up. I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's their answer. Well, I would be able to give you the evidence, but they're hiding it. It's someone else's fault that they don't have the evidence, and that engenders conspiracies. And so that's why today conspiracy theories are so wrapped up in Chupacabra lore.
That's really interesting. And there's another side that I find really interesting as well that you talk about in the book, and that's the fact that the folklore of the Chupacabra is essentially co-opted by another body, and in this case, and we find this a lot in other aspects of folklore, the Chupacabra is kind of co-opted by the church for religious reasons. Can you just say a little bit about how that came about?
Sure. That was a bizarre sideline that I had not expected when I was researching Chupacabra. I'm looking into this sort of vampiric version of Bigfoot, for lack of a better term, and all of a sudden I'm being sidetracked in this bizarre little tangent about the Christian Chupacabra, which I would never have thought that I'd be saying. But yes, it turns out that the Chupacabra was used by Pentecostals as an example of a couple different things. One of them was God's wrath, or Satan, and as you mentioned, I mean, this is. It's to be expected when looking at a subject like this through a folklore prism, because that's what happens, right?
Absolutely.
But if you're looking at it from a cryptozoological prism, that was totally unexpected. It just was. I mean, there is of course the boogeyman aspect to monsters in general, and I've talked about this before. I mentioned this on the Monster Talk podcast. There is a boogeyman aspect to these creatures, as you know, to La Llorona, right? Don't keep the children away from the rivers and the ditches, because La Llorona will get you or you'll drown. Stay away from the woods, stay away from so. The creatures that we fear are often used as sort of moral guidances and nudges away from dangers and stuff. And so it's not surprising in retrospect that Chupacabra would be sort of co-opted by Pentecostals, and saying, in fact, there were in my book I discussed, there were sermons that talked about the evil that is lurking on our island, the Chupacabra, and it's here because we have not been pious enough. And it's God's wrath sent to teach us to put us back on the right path. Another person was another Pentecostal preacher was talking about the Chupacabra as being a sign of the end times. Once again, Armageddon is upon us. Why? Because this vampiric creature is lurking around sucking the blood of goats, of course. And some of them thought they found early references to Chupacabra in Revelations, in the book of Revelations in the Bible, the creatures that come out. And so there was that aspect to it. And then another sort of bizarre tangent related to that was that one of the Chupacabras I investigated ended up in a creationist museum. Which was a Chupacabra found in Blanco, Texas, and I interviewed the guy that stuffed it, that taxidermied it, Jerry Eyre, and it was later sold. The guy didn't know what to do with it because it was an alleged Chupacabra and it made the news and all this, but it was later sold to a guy named John Adolphi, and after some machinations, it ended up being displayed in the Creationist Museum as an example of why scientists are wrong, because of course. If it's like, well, science says, scientists say the Chupacabra can't exist, and here it is. Scientists say the Earth is, 4 billion years later. Clearly, they're wrong because here's the Chupacabra.
That's it. It answers every question, doesn't it? Ultimately, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. What I find interesting about this creature, though, is that we have it coming out in 1995 as a kind of essentially bipedal humanoid creature that then later on in the lore becomes this kind of mangy dog quadruped, for want of a better term. So how has this folklore evolved? How has it gone from one to the other?
Well, that's that was one of the big challenges to me, was trying to figure out how did this happen, right? And so you have two parallel things. You have how the Chupacabra evolution and lore evolved as folklore, and then you also have how the physical Chupacabra evolved, and I'll touch on both of them briefly. The physical one is easier to explain. Because again, the original Chupacabra was, again, it was this spiky-backed alien-type creature that, without revealing too much, was later determined to have come from a science fiction film, actually, the movie Species. It turned out that the very first eyewitness, Madeline Tolentino, the first person to see the Chupacabra, had seen the movie Species just a week or two earlier. And in fact, in interviews at the time, she herself said and remarked on how similar the Chupacabra was to the monster in this movie she'd seen. And at this point, as an investigator, the lights go off, and I'm piecing all this together. And so that was where the original Chupacabra came from. But what happened was that after her initial sighting in 1995, there were a handful of reports and sightings that sort of mimicked hers, but there were never any bodies. And so it was always sort of, I saw something in the woods, and, I heard about Tolentino's sighting because, of course, it was promoted widely. It was on television. It was on tabloids, in particular one tabloid called El Vocero, which is very popular in Puerto Rico. They're a very sensationalist tabloid talking about these lurid stories of blood and guts and all this. And people, of course, heard about this, and there was a sort of form of contagion, right, where people would see things that they heard about. And so for several years after 95 and Tolentino's sighting, that was inspired by the creature in the movie Species, some people would report seeing something like that, but then it faded away because there was no bodies. There was never anything there. It was always sort of these sightings seen, out of the corner of your eye. But that changed in 2000. What happened in 2000 was that was the first year that there was actually a body that was found, and it was found on on a ranch in Nicaragua, on a ranch owned by a man named Jorge Talavera. And I talk about all the Chupacabras in my book, and this one was significant because it was the first time that an actual Chupacabra body or alleged body was found, and it was essentially a dead canid. It was clearly a canid, whether it was a coyote or a dog or what have you, but that's clearly what it was. And from that point on, from about 2000 on, the sightings became these mangy dogs, and that was the pivot. So you went from this interesting situation of having sightings but no bodies to having bodies but no sightings. And so what happened after 2000 was that there were some sightings of Chupacabras, but they were all these dogs, and they were never seen actually draining blood from animals. They weren't seen sucking the blood of goats. They were sort of a retrospective explanation for why bad things happen. So, for example, a farmer would come out and see several of his goats killed or chickens killed, and he would assume, not because he saw a Chupacabra attacking the chickens, but he being aware of the Chupacabra lore and legends and stories and rumors, he would assume, well, this is the work of the Chupacabra. So there must have been, so basically people would invoke the Chupacabra retroactively to explain what happened. And again, this goes back to the vampire lore we were talking about earlier, where bad things happen, unexplainable, and people look for a scapegoat. So that was sort of the transition for the physical thing. And in terms of how the folklore evolved specifically for the Chupacabra, initially after 95 and Tolentino's sighting, again, it was reported by UFO buffs to Jorge Martin's group, UFO buffs sort of sensationalizing the story, and it circulated like all rumors do, backyard gossip among friends and neighbors, and then it was picked up, as I mentioned, by the tabloids. There are 2 or 3 tabloids. The most prominent is El Vocero, which had these sensational stories and blood and photos of stories of just outlandish stuff. Stories of Chupacabras. There was one story I wrote about where a Chupacabra was alleged to have abducted a girl, tattooed a number on her arm, how a Chupacabra tattooed a number on her arm, I don't know. And then afterwards, her IQ allegedly shot up to like 200, either because of the abduction, the tattoo. I mean, it was just such an absurd, purely fictional story, but it was presented in the tabloids as a true story. And so this is you have to keep in mind the context. And so in the first few years of these Chupacabra stories, it was all rumor and gossip and legends and all this journalistic exaggerations, and there was virtually no sober, skeptical, investigative analysis. It was all just sensational stories and rumors. And then it was picked up by the TV show Christina in March 1996, which is sort of the Latin American version of Oprah. So it was very, very popular, and then at that point it really exploded. And then the Chupacabra began being reported and seen in Spanish-speaking areas, for example, Florida, Argentina, Chile. It sort of spread there, and then in 1997 it appeared on the X-Files, and that sort of solidified its place in pop culture history.
But then for the first 5 years, we have this humanoid version, which let's face it, is going to tie in more closely with the vampire lore and all those kinds of things, and at the end of the day is a far more interesting image to conjure up for the Chupacabra. So yeah. Does that then, when we get to 2000 and the canid version kind of comes in, that original image of the Chupacabra just disappears completely?
It mostly does, which was sort of surprising to me. Because again, what happened was that other than Madeline Tolentino seeing the original alien-esque version of the Chupacabra, which, as we now know, is not a coincidence.
Yeah.
Other than her and a few people that were influenced by that, no one saw this thing. I mean, virtually nobody saw the original version of the Chupacabra. Tolentino saw it in a movie. She may have confused it with what she saw in real life. Other people may have seen things that were influenced by it. But keep in mind that as the Chupacabra lore spread to other countries, Texas and Florida and elsewhere, that is far away from the sort of UFO hotbed of Puerto Rico. And so, if you look at it from that perspective, that Chupacabra was no longer accessible. Is probably the way I would put it.
Sure.
The original alien-esque Chupacabra wasn't accessible anymore because the movie came out in '95, and there were some sequels, but I mean, essentially that was the big pivotal moment, and that passed. And so in the years afterward, belief in the Chupacabra persisted, but it was fueled by a sort of a broadening of the definition of Chupacabra. So these days, the word Chupacabra, even though it literally means goatsucker, and it technically refers to the original Chupacabra that was cited and discussed in '95. These days, the word Chupacabra has come to mean anything weird. Basically, any animal, alive or dead, that someone can't immediately identify is called a Chupacabra. I've seen Chupacabras. I've seen things identified as Chupacabra that were a dead fish, a dead raccoon. Any animal that somebody finds on a ranch or washed up, pretty much anywhere, certainly where there's people have heard about the Chupacabra in Spanish-speaking areas, will very likely be called a Chupacabra at some point by somebody, because of course the news media loves a story like that, and the average person doesn't really understand the history of the Chupacabra, and so they don't get that. Number one, it's a vampire, and number two, it refers to a specific thing, and so that's part of the answer to your question is that along the way the Chupacabra has lost its vampirism, because these days that's not entirely true, but these days the vampirism element of the Chupacabra has almost entirely vanished, because what you have are reports and sightings of mangy dogs in Texas and Oklahoma and elsewhere that have no connection to vampirism. It's just a mangy dog, and so, that's Chupacabra. And it's really sort of it's a function of the general public not really knowing the true history of the Chupacabra, and of course sensationalist media and mystery mongers who want to sort of rope in anything into Chupacabra lore.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Now we're running short of time, so that just to wrap up, there's a couple of things that I just want to very, very briefly touch on. You've described a whole range of things in this investigation, which, let's face it, within any motif of folklore that we've looked at, there's a wide range of stuff here. We've got UFOs, we've got alien creatures, we've got conspiracy theories, we've got gene splicing. This is a surprising range of stuff. Now, what was the most surprising thing to you when you looked into this?
Probably the most surprising was, I wasn't that surprised about the alien. I wasn't that surprised about the bloodletting because I had researched cattle mutilations before in the context of UFOs, and so the cattle mutilation, mysterious animal killings isn't that mysterious when you actually look at it and you put it in context. I think probably the most surprising thing to me was that it only dated back to 1995. And it was such a recent creature. I had no idea that was the case when I began my research. And in fact, many people find that hard to believe. Since my book came out, I've had probably a dozen or so people contact me, some politely, some not so politely, and tell me that I'm wrong. And that, I liked your book, but you're wrong about this. I heard about the Chupacabra in 1978, or, my dad told me about the Chupacabra because he saw it, back in 67 in Texas. And my answer is always the same. That's interesting. I appreciate that. I could be wrong. Do you have any evidence? Do you have any references? Do you have any published references at the time that referred to a blood-sucking Chupacabra? There is a bird called the Chupacabra, which sucks milk, not blood, from goats, according to lore. But I always say this. You could be right. I'm not perfect. I make mistakes, just like anybody else. But if what you're saying is true, I appreciate that. I will offer a reward. I'm actually offering a $1,000 reward for any pre-1990s reference to a blood-sucking vampiric Chupacabra. And if you have one, it could be published in a magazine, in a folklore article, in a newspaper, anywhere where it can be independently verified. I would appreciate that. I'll be happy to correct my book and give you a signed copy of my book and $1,000. And so far, no one has taken me up on it. Again, I could be wrong about this. I'm just saying, to the best of my research, it occurred, the Chupacabra emerged in 1995 as a direct result of the first eyewitness seeing this movie Species that looks almost exactly like Chupacabra. That was really what surprised me the most. And again, because it was such a recent creature, that allowed me to have a manageable data set. I don't think I could have so-called solved Bigfoot or solved Nessie or these other things, but because it was such a recent creature, there was a finite number of experts and witnesses and evidence to look at.
So one final question then. Here we are, 22 years later from what we believe to be the first sighting, in inverted commas, of the Chupacabra. Where do we stand now? And I'm not expecting necessarily spoilers for your book, but where do we stand? You say quite happily you have solved the mystery of the Chupacabra.
I believe I have.
So where does this leave us with a creature within folklore?
That's a great question. The fact is that my book and research are not going to be the final chapter of the Chupacabra. I mean, as you know, and as your listeners know, folklore has a life of its own, and nothing I do or say a research or write is going to stop that. The best I can do is to sort of put forth the best evidence that I can collect and put together and say, look, this is what I think this is. I could be wrong. If you have better evidence, by all means, feel free to do better research than I did. I'd love to see it. I think the Chupacabra is going to live on. And it'll be interesting to sort of see what forms it takes. The Chupacabra today, because I am the default Chupacabra guy, I get emails from people every month or two of some mangy dog. And I have a whole folder on my computer of them, and I politely accept them, and I try to give them a brief response back. But the fact is that as long as people find animals that they can't immediately identify. As long as people, report the Chupacabra story and talk about it, the Chupacabra will still live. And so, it's a vampire.
And that wraps it up very neatly. Ben, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a privilege to talk about this subject, which is absolutely fascinating. And as I said at the start of this programme, I don't think has been done real justice within the folklore arena, possibly in the presenting of evidence in quite this detail. So it's been fascinating and brilliant for us to be able to present it to the listeners today. So thank you very much. The Folklore Podcast is created and hosted by me, Mark Norman. Find out more about my writing and research at www.facebook.com/MarkNormanFolklore. The Folklore Podcast art director is Melissa Martell. Find her work at www.mdmcreate.com. The Folklore Podcast will always be free to listen to, but it is an enormous amount of work to research, create, record and write 2 of these episodes every month. And so, we have created a simple way in which you can help to support the ongoing life of the Folklore Podcast. Please visit our website at www.thefolklorepodcast.com and click on support. There are various ways that you can help, and they don't all involve giving us money. Even just leaving a simple review on iTunes or other podcast apps helps to grow our audience. So please do visit and take a moment to help us to keep going. Thank you for listening. The Folklore Podcast theme music is written and performed by Gurdybird.